The air smelled of damp canvas and old tobacco. Private Edward Eddie Whitmore sat on the edge of his cot, holding the letter he had been working on for 3 days. Words wouldn't come easily, not here, not with the sound of distant gunfire punctuating the silence. It was October 1943. Eddie was stationed somewhere along the Italian front, in a village that had long since stopped being a village. Roofs had collapsed, streets were littered with shell fragments, and the church bell tower leaned at an angle that made it look drunk. The letter was for Margaret, his wife back home in Manchester. She didn't know about the frostbite in his fingers, or the shrapnel wound he'd hidden from the medics, so he could stay with his mates. He didn't tell her about Sergeant McAllister, who had bled out in the mud 2 weeks ago, whispering his daughter's name. Instead, he wrote, "The sunsets here are beautiful. I think of you every evening," which was true, but not the whole truth. Orders came at dawn. Their section had to cross the river to secure a bridge before the enemy could blow it up. Without it, supply lines would choke, and the advance would stall. Lieutenant Hayes gathered them around a rough map scratched in the dirt. "We move in 2 sections. Whitmore, you're with me on the left flank. Minimal noise. If the bridge goes, the next lot won't make it." Eddie's stomach tightened. He had crossed rivers before, but never under sniper fire, never with explosives possibly wired beneath the boards. The section moved out under a gray sky. Rain had turned the ground into a slick mess, each step a battle for balance. The river was just ahead, its dark surface moving like something alive and unfriendly. They reached the cover of some willow trees. Hayes raised his hand. "Halt." Across the water, Eddie spotted movement, enemy sentries. 2 of them. They were smoking, rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. The lieutenant whispered, "Whitmore, take the shot when I signal." Eddie's hands didn't shake, not anymore. He took aim. The signal came. 2 cracks of his Lee Enfield. 2 bodies fell. He no longer counted how many faces he had put into the dirt. Counting made it harder to sleep. They crept onto the wooden planks. Every step groaned under their boots. Eddie kept his eyes scanning for wires. Halfway across, he saw them, thin, taut, running from beneath the central support beam to a small metal box near the far end. "Tripwires," he muttered. Hayes crouched. "We disarm it." Carefully. Eddie knelt beside him, trying to ignore the water churning below. His fingers worked the pliers from his kit. The rain made them slippery. One wrong move, and the bridge would be a cloud of splinters. He was halfway through cutting the second wire when shots rang out. Wood splintered inches from his head. "Snipers," someone yelled. Eddie dropped flat, adrenaline flooding his veins. Hayes fired back, but the enemy had good cover. Bullets kept chewing at the planks. "Finish the job," Hayes shouted. Eddie's heart pounded so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He reached for the wire again, ignoring the gunfire, ignoring the instinct to run. Snip! The charge was dead. A sharp pain tore through his shoulder. He fell sideways, breath gone, vision swimming. Eddie never felt the moment his body hit the planks. 1 second he was on his knees, pliers in hand, the river swirling below. The next, he was staring at a sky blurred by pain and rain. The sharp taste of iron filled his mouth, and the world seemed to tilt in strange, uneven lurches. Boots thudded around him, heavy and hurried, the sound echoing on the bridge. Rough hands hooked under his arms, dragging him backwards until the rattle of enemy fire grew a little fainter. The world came back to him in flashes, the wet smell of the river, the shouts of men, the crack of rifles. Private Morales appeared above him, his face pale under the grime. "You're hit bad, Whitmore. Stay with me." His voice was urgent but steady, the kind of tone soldiers used when panic wasn't an option. A hot, burning ache radiated from Eddie's shoulder, every heartbeat sending a fresh wave of pain down his arm. Morales pressed a thick bandage against it, his hands already stained red. Eddie gasped, teeth clenched, but the pressure was the only thing keeping the world from slipping away completely. Somewhere far away, artillery rumbled, slow, rolling bursts that shook the air. The fighting on the bridge still raged, but Eddie's mind had drifted beyond it. He thought of Margaret. Not in the distant, abstract way he sometimes did at night, when the war was quieter. This was sharper, clearer, the kind of thought that cut through pain and fear alike. He saw her sitting in their lounge back home, the firelight playing across her face, the steam from her tea curling upward. He felt again the way her hand fit perfectly into his, warm and steady. In that moment, the bridge meant nothing. The war meant nothing. The orders, the maps, the endless miles of marching and fighting, all of it was just noise. What mattered was the hope, fragile as it was, of getting one more letter to her. The shouts grew more distant as his vision blurred. Men were still firing, still holding the line. Reinforcements would come, someone said. Just hold on. By the time they arrived, Eddie was half-conscious, drifting in and out as the medics worked over him. Their hands were quick, efficient, their words clipped. He tried to listen, but the sound of their voices faded into the steady, distant roar of the river. Eddie came to slowly, as if surfacing from deep water. Above him, the ceiling was a patchwork of tarpaulin and warped boards, swaying faintly in the breeze that crept through gaps. The air was heavy with the sting of iodine, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. His right shoulder was bound in layers of white gauze, the fabric already stained through in places. The pain was no longer sharp, just a deep, steady throb that pulsed with every heartbeat. A nurse appeared at his side, her boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. She placed a small canvas pouch into his hands. "Your effects," she said gently before moving on to the next cot. Inside, he found a few coins, a dented lighter, and the unfinished letter to Margaret, the paper still neatly folded, the ink smudged slightly at the edges. For the next several days, he drifted between sleep and wakefulness. The groans of the wounded filled the tent, mingling with the occasional bark of orders from outside. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. The nurse told him the bridge was safe, the advance continuing. Yet for Eddie, the war felt suspended, as if the record had stopped mid-song. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Eddie sat back down on his cot, the battered writing board balanced on his knees. The tent was quieter than usual. Most of the lads were either on duty or sleeping off exhaustion. The dim light from the single oil lamp overhead flickered with every gust of wind, shadows shifting like restless ghosts across the canvas walls. For days, the unfinished letter to Margaret had sat in his pouch, folded and waiting. He had started it 3 times, once about the weather, once about a stray dog the men had adopted, once about the view from a hill they'd fought to hold. But each time, the words had felt wrong. Too small. Too far from the truth. Tonight, he decided there was no point in pretending. He took up the pencil, the wood worn smooth from use, and began to write slowly, his fingers stiff from the lingering ache in his shoulder. "Margaret," he wrote, "if this reaches you, know that every step I took out here was with you in my thoughts. I have seen things I will never speak of, and I have done things I hope you never understand. But through it all, it was the idea of coming home to you that kept me moving forward." The words seemed heavier than anything he'd ever put to paper, as if they were dragging something out of him that had been lodged deep for months. He paused often, staring at the page, the pencil hovering. In the silence, he could hear the faint drip of water outside and the far-off rumble of artillery. Even in a lull, the war was never truly still. "We've been through a fight I don't know how to explain," he went on. "Bridges, rivers, fields I couldn't tell you the name of, all of it blurs together now. But I remember the faces. I remember the lads who laughed with me one morning and were gone by the evening. And I remember the times I thought I might be next. Every time, it was you that I pictured, waiting for me back home." He stopped there, pressing the pencil to the margin until it left a faint dent. He thought of "yours always," the way he'd signed nearly every letter before. But tonight, that felt like a promise he wasn't certain he could keep. Out here, always was a fragile word. So instead, he wrote simply, "Eddie." He read the letter through once, not changing a single word. Then he folded it carefully, sliding it into the thin envelope. He licked the flap, sealing it shut, and pressed it flat with the palm of his hand. The paper was warm under his skin, as if it had absorbed something of him in the writing. Outside, the mail truck was loading up, a battered vehicle with mud-splattered tires and a driver who smoked between clenched teeth. Eddie stepped out into the damp night, pulling his greatcoat tighter around him. The air smelled of wet earth and distant smoke. "Got one more," he said to the corporal overseeing the mail. The man took it without comment, sliding it into the canvas sack already bulging with letters. Each one, Eddie thought, carried its own small universe, hopes, fears, lies, truths, all jumbled together and sent across the miles to people who could never fully know what their men had endured. As the truck engine coughed to life, Eddie stood for a moment watching it rattle away into the darkness. Somewhere down the line, days or weeks from now, Margaret would open that envelope and read words he could never say aloud. He turned back toward the tent, the sound of the river nearby a low, steady murmur in the night. His shoulder throbbed with each step, but there was a strange lightness in him now, as though, with that letter gone, he'd laid down something heavier than his pack. The war would still be there in the morning. The fighting, the waiting, the endless mud and smoke. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Eddie felt a little closer to home. 2 weeks later, Eddie Whitmore was cleared for light duty. The medic said his shoulder had healed enough for him to move about, though the ache lingered like an unwelcome companion. The fighting was pushing steadily north into Italy now, but the steady stream of stretchers told him that the cost of every mile was still being paid in full. They didn't send him back to the front line, not yet. Instead, he was assigned to a small supply detail, moving crates of ammunition, blankets, and tinned rations from depot trucks to forward positions. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't carry the same rush of danger as holding a rifle, but Eddie knew better than to think of it as safe. In war, trouble didn't need an invitation, it came looking. The days blurred together in a rhythm of lifting, hauling, and trudging along muddy tracks. Villages appeared and disappeared as the front shifted, some still smoldering from bombardments, others eerily quiet, their windows boarded and streets littered with shell fragments. Every so often, a shot would ring out from somewhere unseen, and they would drop their loads, rifles in hand, scanning rooftops and hedgerows until the silence returned. One evening, as the sun sagged low and painted the sky in muted golds, Eddie's detail moved through a village that had only been liberated that morning. The signs of occupation were everywhere, walls pockmarked with bullet holes, doors splintered, laundry lines hanging limp between broken shutters. The air still held the faint tang of gunpowder. They were halfway down the main street when an old man emerged from a doorway. His clothes were worn thin, and his back was bent, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he walked. He moved slowly toward Eddie, ignoring the other soldiers. Eddie stopped, unsure if he should reach for his rifle or stand his ground. Without a word, the old man held out something wrapped in a cloth. Eddie hesitated before taking it, and when he unwrapped the cloth, he found a small, rough loaf of bread inside, still warm, the crust golden. The old man spoke in Italian, his voice cracked but steady. Eddie caught none of the words, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Gratitude needed no translation. Eddie tried to hand the bread back, but the man shook his head firmly, closing Eddie's fingers over it. For a moment, their eyes met, one pair worn by years of life, the other by months of war, and Eddie understood that this was not charity. This was thanks. He nodded, murmured a quiet thank you, and the man gave a faint smile before shuffling back into the shadows of his doorway. Eddie stood there for a moment, the bread warm against his palms, feeling the strange weight of it. In all his months here, the war had been a relentless tide of destruction. Bridges blown, homes shattered, fields turned into graves. But this was different. This was something made, not broken. When he rejoined the column, one of the lads asked where he'd gotten it. Eddie didn't answer straight away. He just broke the loaf in half, handing a piece to the man beside him. They ate in silence as they walked on, the crust crackling softly between their teeth. Later, when they reached their bivouac, Eddie tucked the memory away alongside the few he wanted to keep, the laughter of his mates before a march, the smell of Margaret's lavender perfume when she'd hugged him goodbye at the station, the sight of the sun cutting through the clouds after a night-long bombardment. It struck him then that not every part of this war was about taking. Sometimes it was about holding a bridge so supplies could get through, holding a village so its people could see another day, holding on to the moments that proved humanity hadn't been lost entirely in the smoke and rubble. That night, as the men settled down and the sky turned black over the camp, Eddie lay awake a little longer than usual. He thought about the old man in the village and how he'd pressed that bread into his hands as if it were the most important thing he could give. In a way, maybe it was. And Eddie realized that in a war built on tearing things apart, the smallest acts of kindness could feel like victories all their own. By the time spring rolled around, the war had taken on a different shape. The push into Germany was no longer just a plan, it was happening in earnest. Maps at headquarters showed arrows sweeping deeper into enemy territory each week, and the papers back home were probably printing words like momentum and breakthrough. But Eddie Whitmore didn't see it in arrows or headlines. He saw it in the faces around him. Fresh lads stepping off supply trucks with polished boots and confident grins, eager for their first taste of action. They moved with a swagger that made the veterans exchange knowing glances. Eddie had lost count of how many times he'd seen that swagger vanish within days, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had heard too much gunfire and too many last breaths. Sometimes, the faces just disappeared altogether. The weather was warming, but the toll the war exacted felt heavier than ever. There was no end to the lifting, marching, digging, and waiting. No shortage of orders that sent men forward and returned fewer of them. Eddie kept his head down and did his work, knowing luck could run out at any moment. Through it all, he kept writing to Margaret. The routine of it steadied him. The way each letter began with her name in his handwriting. The way he would stop mid-sentence to remember the exact shade of her hair in the morning light. Her replies came as regularly as the post would allow, each envelope a little lifeline. She never filled them with questions he couldn't answer, never asked him to explain the things he avoided putting into words. Her letters always smelled faintly of lavender, a scent so tied to home that Eddie sometimes tucked the paper back into the envelope after only a few lines, just to breathe it in and imagine her standing in their kitchen. She would write about her garden, the neighbors, and the little repairs she was trying to manage around the house. Sometimes, she told him about the rain in Manchester, as though he didn't already have enough of it in Italy. He never told her about the things he saw, about the boy from Leeds who had been so sure the war wouldn't touch him until a mortar landed 2 feet away, about the long hours crouched behind rubble listening to enemy machine guns chew the air. Those belonged to the part of himself he intended to leave behind when he came home. On the morning of May 8, 1945, Eddie was in what had once been a grand train station. The roof was mostly gone, jagged beams pointing skyward like broken ribs. The platforms were choked with debris, and pigeons had claimed the high rafters that remained. He was moving crates with 2 other men when the news arrived. The war in Europe was over. At first, it was only a murmur passing between soldiers. Then it grew, building into cheers that bounced off the crumbling walls. Someone fired a rifle into the air, then another joined in, and soon the sound of celebration mixed with the metallic ring of spent casings hitting the floor. Laughter echoed where, not so long ago, there had only been the bark of orders and the groan of the wounded. Eddie stopped what he was doing and stood still for a long moment. His hands rested on the crate he'd been carrying, but his mind was far away. He felt tired. Not the kind of tired a night's sleep could fix, but a deep weariness that had settled into his bones over years of fighting. Relief was there, yes, but it was tangled with something heavier. Victory, he realized, didn't bring back Sergeant McAllister. It didn't bring back the lads he'd shared cigarettes with in foxholes, the ones who had teased him about his Manchester accent, the ones who had made plans for after the war that would never be kept. For them, the fighting had ended months or years before, in ditches and fields and on bridges far from home. Around him, men were embracing, shouting, making plans to drink until dawn. Eddie gave a faint smile, but didn't join in. He thought of Margaret, of her waiting at the station, of walking through their front door and seeing her framed in the light from the window. That was where his mind went. Not to the victory, not to the speeches that would be made in London, but to the quiet street in Manchester where she would be. The war in Europe was over. But Eddie knew the war inside him would take longer to end. When Eddie finally stepped off the train at Manchester Victoria Station, the noise and color of civilian life seemed almost overwhelming. Porters shouted, whistles blew, and the steam from the engine curled in the air like ghostly memories of the battlefield. But then he saw her. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes shining with tears, her hands clasped tightly as though afraid he might vanish if she blinked. The moment their eyes met, the months of separation collapsed into nothing. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding him with a fierceness that spoke of all the nights she'd waited. In that embrace, the war, for Eddie, at least, finally ended. They went home together, walking streets that seemed smaller than he remembered. On their mantelpiece sat the letter he had written from the hospital, carefully framed. Margaret said it was because it reminded her he had come back. Eddie rarely spoke of what happened at the bridge. But whenever they crossed the old stone bridge near their home, he would slip his fingers into hers and hold on a little tighter. Because he knew, in his bones, how easily a bridge could be lost.